Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Pamela Cohn. Welcome to the Buying Legal Counsel's Expert Roundtable panel discussion on social impact and sustainability. My name is Pamela Cohn, and I'm the founder of Amity Advisory, which is a consultancy that focuses in the legal industry to help address social impact and sustainability. I'm joined with three of my favorite people in the business today. Adam Roy Gordon is the Sustainable Development Goal Advocate and Engagement Director for the United Nations Global Compact. Welcome, Adam. We also have with us Arnaud from CO2 Logic Consulting. He is definitely known in the industry. He is the author of the Handbook on Carbon Accounting. And Carol Liffman, who is a well-known expert in sustainability for a number of industries. Welcome all of you, and thank you so much for joining. As Sylvia mentioned, we are going to have a conversation first. People will be invited to put their questions in the chat box or in the Q&A section, and we will address questions at the end. So Arnaud, I would like to start with you. What trends are you seeing in the growing social impact and sustainability space in US and abroad? You work, I think, across the globe. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I come from Belgium, so I work both in Europe and in the US. I've been in New York for the last 4 years. And of course, like CO2 Logic, it's in the name, we are focused on CO2. But what we have seen over the last 2 years is a growing interest in climate. And when I say growing, it's really spectacular. So we see that many of our clients, prospects, most of the business leaders I'm discussing with are really understanding that climate change is going to stay. That's going to be the big crisis of the 21st century. And of course, it started well before COVID-19. But I think that with that crisis that was not anticipated, you know, like no one believed that we would have a pandemic in 2020. That was not, if you look at the risks that were anticipated, it was not one of the key risks that we were anticipating, but people realize that climate is really going to hit us and that they need to take action. So I think, of course, it's a long process, you know, like the Paris Agreement was already a momentum, but the demonstration of students early last year really changed everything, I believe. I could see clients, you know, people in their 50s, in their 60s that started to discuss this not after reading an article in the media, but after discussing this with their grandkids. And I think that's the whole difference. You know, when you start having those difficult conversations about what legacy are we going to give to our kids and grandkids, and what role are we going to have in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, if we keep having heat wave, if we have more and more hurricanes, typhoons, and all those climatic disasters that the models are showing us we will get to if we don't change the way we consume energy and the way we produce and consume stuff. And of course, you might wonder, what's in it for a legal firm? You know, what's the link between, when you think about climate action, you think about big utilities, you think about the coal industry, you think about oil and gas, and you're right to do so because they represent a big part of the impact. But we also know that lawyers are critical for those industries, and lawyers are also very big buyers themselves. You know, even if it's legal services, you need to use a computer, you need to use data centers, you need to travel. When you look at the footprint, and I think all those of you who are working in law firm probably are experiencing a very different year this year because we are not traveling. While when I discuss with some of my legal clients, they are constantly hopping from one plane to another, traveling all over the world. And that's one thing that we need to do differently in the future. So maybe COVID would be an opportunity in that sense, but we really see that climate is becoming a key issue for most people looking at ESG. And of course, ESG is very broad. It's also about social, it's also about governance, and we need to pay attention to this. But when we look at the environment, the biggest threat is climate, and that's what we see our clients are telling us, and that's where they're investing as well.
Excellent, thank you. Carol, what are you seeing with respect to your client base and the whole focus on ESG or social impact and sustainability?
Well, I'm here in Houston, and so we are really having a double whammy of COVID plus the collapse of oil prices, meaning that companies may not have discretionary funds. But we're not seeing any lessening of interest in ESG. You know, perhaps some tempering because of the urgent realities of dealing with COVID. Of course, Houston medical complex, so they're getting a lot of attention right now. So I would say people are definitely more cognizant of the S of ESG. They're thinking about all of the social impacts and how we can see those playing out as people are losing jobs, they're losing health care, is that right? But you know, we're continuing to see people interested in the environment and climate. And from the governance perspective, we're really seeing a lot of people interested in this idea of social justice, racial justice, environmental justice, and that's not going away. People are seeing those as interlinked concerns and something that boards and executives really have to address in a meaningful way right now. There's not going to be any excuse in the future for poor D&I stats. We've been looking for equal employment opportunities and whatnot for 50 years, so we've had time to try and address it. I think another thing related to that and all about purpose, you know, more and more companies are saying we need to revisit this idea of purpose and think about it not from us inside the company, but what are our stakeholders thinking about our purpose? You know, we're seeing a lot of consumers really spending money with those companies that are purpose-driven, and we think that will continue. You know, one thing, we see so many articles, I'm sure everyone sees articles about the new normal and how are we going to create the new normal. Well, we already know what the new normal looks like. We have the SDGs that's laying out the path to the sort of thriving, healthy world where communities can really achieve great things. So, you know, if we're thinking about the new normal, let's just say a lot of smart people came up with the SDGs, and let's, you know, stay. Thing is to echo what Arnaud said. We have so much interest in TCFD. Everyone is curious, you know, how are we going to adapt this into our own business? What do we have to do by when? And so I think that framework is one that's really, really done a lot to promote climate action in the corporate world.
So just quickly, before I move on to Adam, tell me what the acronym means, TCFD.
Oh, TCFD, right. Everybody asks that, and in fact, I wrote down, spell it out, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure.
Okay, thank you.
But beyond financial disclosure, it's really bringing to the corporate world those questions about insurance and so forth. And surprisingly, among medium and small companies that we typically deal with, it's often the general counsel who's approaching us for help on that.
Excellent. So Carol touched on external frameworks, Adam. That's a perfect tee up for you for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Tell me about them and tell me how you see the corporate world adopting them and changing behaviors as a result.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's just good to level set and introduce the Global Compact as well as part of that. From where I'm sitting. So the United Nations Global Compact is the UN's Corporate Sustainability Initiative. We're a special initiative of the Secretary General's office, founded under then Secretary General Kofi Annan and now under our third Secretary General Guterres. I lead the US network of the Global Compact, so I'm the primary point of contact for US domiciled companies. Arnaud mentioned the Paris Agreement earlier that came out in 2015, and 2015 was a pretty momentous year for sustainable development across the board. In addition to the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed to, and they really do represent the highest ambition that we have collectively as a planet for what we want to achieve by 2030. So I saw them on the screen earlier. There's 17 goals, really addressing everything from poverty, equality, climate action, rule of law, I think relevant to this audience, and really it's been agreed upon by all member states, so all countries of the world. But what was unique about the process of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda is the seat at the table for business. There's a recognition within the UN, and rightfully so, now that we can't achieve the world we want, we can't solve the problems that we have without the role of business. I mean, it's so simple as saying you can't solve poverty without jobs, you can't create jobs without business. But obviously, with climate change, with decent work, supply chains, etc., business is at the heart of solving these problems. In terms of the role of business, so the SDGs have been really taken as that framework, that universal framework by business around the world, but more and more in the US, particularly with the lack of federal guidelines and dare I say leadership on many of these issues. Companies, particularly those that are global, but certainly those that are only domestic as well, are looking for guides, for guidance, for frameworks. And the Sustainable Development Goals are that universally accepted set of goals and ambitions. And there's an opportunity for all companies, regardless of size or sector, to figure out how they can support the achievement of those SDGs, both in terms of where they can have a positive impact and also where to mitigate their negative impacts. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Excellent, thank you so much. And that actually is a perfect cue into our first poll, because all of you mentioned that you're seeing an increased focus on this, and that one of the ways we are able to address societal problems is through business and through the partnerships we work with in our business. So just out of curiosity, those of you who are listening in, please vote or please answer this question. Are questions around environmental, social, and governance policies and practices, are they increasing in RFPs, staying the same, less often used, or I've never seen questions around ESG in RFPs? Okay, hopefully people have voted. Sylvia, can you show us the results? Excellent. Increasingly used, or at least staying the same. Very few have said that it's going to decrease. That's very interesting. Thank you. So Adam, I also recognize, because we spoke earlier this week, so I'm going to start with you on this, that you, meaning the United Nations Global Compact, I believe, has published a guide for General Council on social impact and sustainability issues. Tell us a little bit about that, and if our audience is interested in it, where they could find it.
So the Guide for General Council on Corporate Sustainability is one of the plethora of resources that we publish to support our member companies and non-member companies in their journey towards corporate sustainability and achieving the SDGs. Just want to quickly note that there may be some signatories to the Global Compact on the call, and if so, thanks for joining. If you're not yet a signatory of the Global Compact, we are a call to action, a commitment to action for all organizations, including law firms in the world. And so it's a commitment from the company's highest level executive for law firms, that's often a managing partner, potentially a chair, to the Secretary General, affirming your commitment to the norms and values of the UN and the ambition of the SDGs. So the rules, the Guide for General Counsel, particularly in the United States, but certainly around the world, the role of lawyers in-house and otherwise is really critical to the achievement of corporate sustainability. So often lawyers are seen as the mechanism to manage risk, to mitigate risk. But what we really want and really believe that lawyers are in their own right, able to really further the achievement of sustainability. And so we developed a guide. It just was developed under version 2. So it was previously released a few years ago with Baker McKenzie, Linklaters, and several others, really walking through what a lawyer, in-house or otherwise, can learn about corporate sustainability and how they can play an active role in the achievement for their organizations. And it's really quite comprehensive. It's meant to be even an intro document, so you don't need to have a background in corporate sustainability. It's meant for lawyers really everywhere. And then of course, there are ways to deepen your understanding and engagement and expertise with our other resources. Yeah, and I could answer direct questions about that. The guide and a lot of our work will around and for lawyers is around our rule of law action platform. It's a multi-stakeholder working group that with member states, leading companies, civil society organizations that we convene to really figure out what guidance companies can have and what tools companies can have to reinforce peace, justice, and rule of law. And you cannot achieve the world we want without rule of law. I mean, I think right now we're really seeing the impacts or the value of that in ways that I would never would have imagined previously. And just to reinforce, lawyers have a seat at the table, be it in supply chains and policies or just in day-to-day work. And so that tool is there to support that. And I'm available outside of this this call to help introduce anyone to that work.
Excellent. It reminds me of a quote, Gina Passarella, who's the editor of American Lawyer, on their 40th anniversary last year. She said, "The legal industry employs hundreds of thousands of people in touches in every other industry in the world. We not only have a seat at the table, we should be leading the conversation in many respects." So I want to go back. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say that, you know, so often lawyers are thinking about how to support their clients, and you know, they're thinking about perhaps the sustainability of their clients. But law firms are large industries, large businesses in their own right, have buying power, have impacts, and the SDGs are that universal framework to guide that work.
Yep, absolutely. Now I want to go back to something that both Arnaud and Carol touched on, and that is the pandemic. Given the current global situation, not just the pandemic, but also some of the social unrest that we're experiencing right now, do you believe the focus on social impact and sustainability behaviors at companies is likely to increase or decrease in your opinion? And does this include the vendor and service provider expectations that we talked about earlier? So let's start with Carol.
Well, I think it's going to be increasing. As I say, you know, it's been 50 years trying to do equal employment opportunities and whatnot. And women are increasingly being recognized, though not at the highest levels of business. And I think, you know, we're all seeing that a lot of people that we rely they need in terms of healthcare, childcare, all of these areas. So I think it's going to be increasingly important that we create the social networks that people need to have this healthy, thriving life.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Arnaud.
I also think it's going to increase, and I think that COVID gives the example. You know, like one of the first things that the current administration took was to provide free healthcare for COVID-related services, which I think, and I know I'm European, so, you know, of course, I've been used to having government taking care of healthcare before I moved to the US, and it was a surprise for me to discover that that wasn't the case in all developed countries. But and I know it's a big debate and it's complex to address, but I think that the example of COVID, you know, if we start having hurricanes and if we start to have, we also know that there will be more diseases, you know, like higher temperature also means that there will be more mosquitoes, there will be more insects, more disease that are going to be climate related. And with all those things that are going to hit the poorest first, and without having some, social nets to make sure that those people can still get access to healthcare. I think things we need to be, that's going to lead to some changes. And I don't know how we are going to do it in the US. I understand there will be probably more space for the private sector as well, but there will be need for innovation. There will be need for doing things differently. And again, when we think climate change, very often we see this as an environmental issue, but it's more and foremost a public health issue. And like environmental, when you look at global environmental issues, we don't care about them just because we like birds and we like trees, but it's also because it's our only home, and we might be able to colonize Mars in 10 or 15 or 20 years, and I hope that we do, because I also like innovation and progress, but we are not going to move 7 billion people or 9 billion people to Mars, and I think it's important to take care of our planet, and the life is possible on this planet because of a very thin layer that protects us and that make it at bearable temperature. And if we start changing the composition of the atmosphere, which we do by releasing greenhouse gases, we are going to mess everything up, and there will be no way to fix this. Once we don't have a healthy atmosphere, we will have dramatic climate change, and it will be too late to act. So I think it's important for people to realize that the decision that we are going to make in the next 10 years are going to be critical for the survival of mankind. That's what we're talking about. And I think that COVID is really a good reminder that we are not invincible.
And I'll just add this comment, that what COVID and climate change have in common is both require a global response. This isn't something that stops at country borders or state borders or county borders. It's going to affect the whole planet. So it's not something we can do by ourselves, or one country fix it and the other countries don't. This might be a good time for our next poll, Sylvia, because I think it talks about what we expect post-pandemic. When we emerge from the pandemic, do you believe ESG issues will decrease because there's just so many other things to address? Increase because, as we talked earlier, the awareness of corporate behavior by all stakeholders will be higher than ever? Or no change, it's just going to remain a side issue? Okay, Sylvia, whenever you're ready. Oh, good. I think this is really good news. Nobody said it was going to decrease. 92% it was going to increase, and just 8% said no change at all. That's very, very heartening. Now it's kind of a personal question for each of you. What is the greatest lesson you've learned in this quest for greater sustainability and practices in the corporate world? And I'll start with Carol. What's the greatest lesson you've learned?
Well, there's so many lessons, it's hard to pick one, but when you think about sustainability being such a broad topic, and we know, we talked earlier about the 17 SDGs, it's that you really have to have integration. You have to have integration into your core business, and you have to have integration among the various goals that you might have. And I think that it's lucky that, especially in the last couple of years, we see more and more emphasis by boards and C-suites to really be leading this by making it a responsibility of line managers. People are no longer saying like, oh, that's something that those nice people in that department take care of for me. They have their own goals and objectives that they have to accomplish in order to related to that idea of integration. I think it's that you really always have to keep your systems thinking cap on, that we see so much interaction between different elements. And if you're not trying to think of that whole system, you're going to have unintended consequences and things happening that you would not have, that you're not aware of unless you are thinking of the whole system. So those two things really, integrations, systems thinking, and considering all your stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Adam, biggest lesson learned?
I mean, it's a big question. I perhaps have a more Nordic view of capitalism and the role of business, but I could tell you that in my years working in the US on corporate sustainability, it has really deepened my respect on the power of business to achieve outcomes, and perhaps maybe opened up my eyes to the power of libertarian thinking on how businesses can solve problems that government can't. Because like it or not, particularly in the US, we're not going to solve many of these problems in politics. Business is going to solve these problems. The Paris Agreement's that example. The US says we're pulling out, business steps up and says we're still going to meet those targets. Business can solve these problems, and not only can business solve these problems, but business should solve these problems regardless of the size of that business.
Yeah.
Thank you. Arnaud.
I'm going to echo both Carol and Adam because I think it's all interrelated, and I gave the example between environment and health, but I think it's also true between environmental outcome, social outcome, and financial outcome. I think when we talk about the triple bottom line, what the future is going to show us is that you won't be able to be a profitable business in the long run if you are damaging the two other capitals. You know, like if you don't respect your employees, that's going to be bad for your business. If you don't respect the planet, that's going to be bad for your business. And I think that people are starting to realize this, and there will be massive shifts in asset allocation. We can think of the coal industry. That was one example. Those of you who had investment in coal 10 years ago probably did not make much money with it. And I think that externalities are going to become more and more visible. And I agree with Adam that it's not necessarily going to be through state intervention. I don't see like a heavy carbon tax tomorrow in the US, but I think that businesses are going to start using what we call in our jargon, internal carbon price, basically putting a voluntary price on the carbon emission, and they're going to act as if there was a price on carbon emission to reduce those externalities. And what I'm describing here with carbon, I think we could do it with other externalities as well. And I really hope that business will use the power of markets to tackle those injustices and make sure that we can solve all the 17 SDGs.
Excellent, thank you. Something Carol said reminded me of how this really has to be core to the business's purpose. It's insufficient now to have a little committee on the side that, you know, organizes volunteer outings and perhaps, you know, has some money to spend at the end of the year if you've had a profitable year. It really has to be core to who the business is and what the business is doing in order to really have the greatest social impact possible. So one more big grandiose question for each of you, and then we'll take questions from the attendees. What should or could the legal industry be doing? And we'll start with Adam this time.
I mean, it really, sorry, you're hearing a screaming kid in the background. It starts with just recognizing that you have impact and that you have responsibility and the ability to act. Looking at your supplier code of conduct, looking at your supply chains in general, understanding your impacts there. I think also understanding how to position yourselves vis-a-vis clients, or if you're in-house, other areas in your business, and how really taking a role and an expertise in corporate sustainability as a whole will position you advantageously with respect to those other businesses, both externally and internally. To really own this as an area of responsibility. There are specific areas in which you can do that, but really you need to assess what's most material for your business.
Excellent. Carol?
Well, I think the people in legal departments are well placed to really show a lot of leadership. around this, and to take their companies out of a compliance view and into making it a core part of the business. You know, people who have the legal training are critical thinkers. They learn how to be persuasive and give good arguments, so they can help a lot of us who maybe don't have those skills in how to position these issues to have the most meaningful conversations with our boards and our C-suite.
Excellent. Arnaud, what could and should the legal industry be doing?
So I think first they should lead by example. I think it's really hard to lecture people if you don't do it yourself. And I know it can be intimidating because frankly, I've done lots of benchmarks. So we have 3 or 4 clients among some of the largest law firms. And so we have done some benchmark, and I would say that law firms are lagging behind some other industries. And that's normal. That's because law firms typically have a very small footprint, you know, like besides business travel and buying paper, they don't have such a big impact directly. But by going through the process and by not being afraid to do some learning by doing, I've seen that this has changed dramatically the way my clients are doing business. Like that created so many opportunities for them because, you know, for instance, we just helped one client starting to think about becoming carbon neutral and sourcing renewable energy. And these are things that the clients are doing. So by going through the process with us and looking at this with their legal eyes, they identify new business opportunities for them. They know that they can start helping their big clients that also want to become carbon neutral or that also want to start sourcing renewable electricity. And believe me, like doing this in the US, it's complicated, but if you operate businesses in 55 or 65 countries, sourcing renewable energy can be really, really complex, and you do need lawyers. And so you might think as a law firm, my electricity consumption, it's only, you know, like 1 million annually. If you take like some of the largest law firm, if you are mid-size, it might only be 100,000. Why would I care about how I source renewable electricity? But the answer is that by investigating this, that's going to create opportunities for you with your clients that might consume, you know, 10,000 times more electricity than you do. So that would be my 2 recommendations. Don't be like, lead by example, and don't be afraid to start doing things by, you know, learning things by doing them.
I'm glad you mentioned that about doing it from a law firm's perspective, doing it yourself first would and could open up opportunities for you to then advise and counsel your clients on the same sorts of initiatives. And that goes back to one of the things I was saying earlier. Until this becomes sort of core to our business and perhaps even a business line, we will not be as effective as it's something that happens over here on the side. Oh, that's our facilities people who focus on that, or that's our green team or our charitable giving team. It really has to be part and parcel to the business function, whether you're a law firm or whether you're a company.
Yeah.
So with that, I want to thank all of you for participating. We will move on to questions and answers, but first I wanted to thank you all, and we will not record the questions and answers. So